The Most Holy Mary remains in the portal of the Nativity until the coming of the Magi Kings. By the infused knowledge of Holy Scriptures and her high supernatural enlightenment, our great Queen knew that the Magi Kings of the Orient would come to acknowledge and adore her Most Holy Son as their true God. She was aware of it also more particularly because an angel had been sent to them to announce the birth of the incarnate Word, as mentioned in chapter 2. And the Virgin Mother was not ignorant of this message. St. Joseph had no foreknowledge of these mysteries because they had not been revealed to him, nor had his most prudent spouse informed him of this secret. In all things she was most wise and discreet, awaiting the sweet and timely dispositions of the divine providence. Wisdom 8:1. After the circumcision, the holy spouse suggested to the mistress of heaven that they leave their poor and forsaken habitation on account of the insufficient shelter which it afforded the divine infant and to her, for it would now be possible to find a lodging in Bethlehem, where they could remain until after presenting the child in the temple of Jerusalem. This proposal of the most faithful spouse arose from his solicitude and anxiety. lest the child and the mother should want even that comfort and convenience which it was possible for their poverty to procure, but he left it all to the disposition of his heavenly spouse. Without revealing the mystery, the humble queen answered, quote, "My spouse and master, I resign myself to thy will, and wherever thou wishest to go, I will follow with great pleasure. Arrange it as thou pleasest." Unquote. The heavenly lady had an affection for the cave on account of its humbleness and poverty, and because the incarnate Word had consecrated it by the mysteries of his nativity and circumcision, and was to hallow it by the mystery of the Magi visit, although she did not know at what time that would happen. This was a most pious affection, full of devotion and reverence, yet she preferred to give an example of the highest perfection in all things. She considered it more important to resign and submit to St. Joseph, letting her spouse decide what was to be done. While they were thus conferring with each other, the Lord himself informed them through the two celestial princes, Michael and Gabriel, who were attending in corporal forms to the service of their Lord and God and of their great Queen. They spoke to Mary and Joseph, saying, quote, "Divine Providence has ordained that 3 kings of the earth, coming from the Orient in search of the King of Heaven, should adore the divine Word in this very place." Psalms 71:6. They are already 10 days on the way, for at the hour of the birth of Jesus they were informed of it, and they immediately set out on their journey. Therefore they will shortly arrive, fulfilling all that the prophets had from very ancient times foreknown and foretold. Unquote. By this announcement, St. Joseph was instructed on his part concerning the will of the Lord, and Mary, his most holy spouse, said to him, quote, "My master, this place chosen by the Most High for such magnificent mysteries, although it is poor and ill-furnished in the eyes of the world, in the sight of the eternal wisdom is rich, precious, the most estimable and preferable on this earth, since the Lord of heaven is satisfied with it and has consecrated it by his presence. He who is the true land of promise can favor us with his vision in this place, and if it is his pleasure, he will afford us some protection and shelter against the inclemencies of the weather during the few days in which we are to stay here." Unquote. St. Joseph was much consoled and encouraged by these words of the most prudent queen. He answered her that since the divine child was to fulfill the law, which required him to be presented in the temple, just as he had subjected himself to the law of circumcision, they could remain in this sacred place until that day should arrive, without first undertaking the distant and wearisome journey to Nazareth during the inclement weather. If, perhaps, the severity of the season would compel them to seek shelter in the city, they could easily do so, since from Bethlehem to Jerusalem there was only a distance of 2 hours. In all these matters the Most Holy Mary conformed herself to the will of her watchful spouse, for she knew his solicitude for the sacred tabernacle which was confided into his care, and which was more holy and venerable than the Holy of Holies in the temple. Awaiting the time when her only begotten should be presented in the temple, she was unremitting in her care of him, lest she forget anything necessary to protect him against the cold and the roughness of the weather. She also prepared the cave for the arrival of the kings, cleaning it once more and arranging it anew as far as the rudeness and destitution of the place allowed. But her greatest attention and care was always reserved for the child itself, bearing it in her arms continually, unless absolute necessity demanded otherwise. Besides all this, she made use of her power as queen of all creation, whenever the rigors of winter rose to excess, for she commanded the frost and the winds, the snow and the ice not to incommode their Creator, and to spend their elemental fury and asperity upon her person alone. The heavenly queen gave her commands as follows, quote, "Restrain your wrath before your Creator, Author, Lord, and Preserver, who has called you into existence and given you strength and activity. Be mindful, creatures of my beloved, that you are furnished with rigor on account of sin for the chastisement of the disobedience of the first Adam and his progeny. But with the second Adam, who comes to repair this fall, and cannot have any part therein, you must be courteous, reverencing and not offending him, to whom you owe worship and subjection. And therefore I command you in his name to cause no inconvenience or displeasure to him." Unquote. It is worthy of our admiration and imitation to notice the ready obedience of the irrational creatures to the divine will intimated to them by the Mother of God. For upon her command the snow and rain approached no nearer than 10 yards. The winds stopped short, and the surrounding air retained a mild temperature. To this miracle was added another one. At the same time in which the divine infant in her arms received this homage of the elements and was protected from their asperity, the Virgin Mother felt and suffered the cold and inclemency of the weather as if it were exerting all its natural influences in that place. In this they obeyed the loving Mother and sovereign mistress of creatures to the letter, as she wished not to exempt herself from their asperity while she prevented her tender child and her God from suffering under it. Saint Joseph enjoyed the same privilege as the sweet infant. He noticed the favorable change of the temperature without knowing that it was due to the commands of his heavenly spouse and an effect of her power, for she had not manifested to him this privilege, because she had no command to the effect from the Most High. Because she had no command to that effect from the Most High. As to the order and manner in which the great queen nourished her child Jesus, all capitals, it is to be remarked that she offered him her virginal milk 3 times a day, and always with such reverence that she asked his permission beforehand and his pardon for the indignity, considering herself and acknowledging herself unworthy of such a privilege. Many times, while holding him in her arms, she was on her knees adoring him, and if at any time it was necessary to seat herself, she always asked his permission. With the same tokens of reverence, she handed him to Saint Joseph, and received him from his arms, as I have said above. Many times she kissed his feet, and when she wished to kiss his face, she interiorly asked his benevolent consent. The sweetest child returned these caresses of his mother, not only by the expression of pleasure in his countenance, which was at the same time full of majesty, but also by other actions usual in children. In him, however, they were accompanied by a serene deliberation. The most ordinary token of his love was to recline sweetly upon the breast of the most pure mother, or upon her shoulder, encircling her neck with his divine arms. These caresses the Empress Mary met with so much attention and discretion that she neither petulantly sought them, as other mothers, nor too timidly withdrew from them. In all these things she behaved most perfectly and prudently, without defect or excess of any kind. The more openly and affectionately her most holy Son manifested his love toward her, so much the more deeply did she humiliate herself, and so much the greater was her reverence. In the same manner she gauged also the tokens of her affection, and lent new glory to her magnanimity. There was an interchange of caresses of other kind between the infant and his mother, for besides understanding by divine enlightenment all the interior acts of the most holy soul of her only begotten, as I have already stated, it often happened that, holding him in her arms, she was privileged to see through his humanity as through a crystal casement, thus perceiving the hypostatic union of the Son of God with his human nature, and witnessing the activity of his soul in interceding with the Eternal Father for the human race. Wow. These operations and intercessions the Heavenly Lady faithfully imitated, being entirely absorbed and transformed in her divine Son. His Majesty, on his part, looked upon her with new accidental joy and delight, regaling himself in the purity of this creature, rejoicing that he had created her, and that his becoming man had resulted in such a living image of his divinity and humanity. In regard to this mystery, the words of the soldiers of Holofernes, when they beheld the beauty of Judith in the camp of Bethulia, occurred to me, quote, "Who can despise the people of the Hebrews who have such beautiful women? Shall we not think it worth our while for their sakes to fight against them?" Unquote. This saying seemed to be mysteriously realized in the incarnate Word, since he, with greater cause, could address them to his eternal Father and to all the rest of the creatures. Quote, "Who shall fail to see that my coming from heaven and assuming flesh is fully justified, since by coming upon the earth and dethroning the demon, the world, and the flesh, and by conquering and vanquishing them, such a woman is called into existence as is my mother among the children of Adam." Unquote. O sweetest love, essence of my virtue, life of my soul, most loving Jesus, behold and see that most holy Mary by herself possesses such immense beauty as exceeds that of all the human race. She is the only and chosen one, Canticles 6:8, so perfectly pleasing to thee, my Lord and my God, that she not only equals but far surpasses all the rest of thy people, and that she alone compensates God for all the wickedness of the race of Adam. So powerful were the effects of this delightful intercourse with her Son and true God, that she was more and more spiritualized and made godlike. Many times in these flights of her soul, the force of her burning love would have torn asunder the ligaments of her members and destroyed the union of her soul and body, if she had not been miraculously comforted and preserved. She spoke to her most holy Son secret words, exalted and full of weight, that they cannot come within the range of our expression. All that I can reproduce can never be anything more than a mere shadow of that which was manifested to me. She said to him, quote, "O my love, sweet life of my soul, who art thou, and who am I? What dost thou wish to make of me by thus becoming man of man, lowering thy greatness and magnificence in favor of such useless dust? Oh, what shall thy slave do to pay the debt of love which she owes to thee? What return shall I make for the great things which thou hast done to me?" Psalms 115:12. My being, my life, my faculties, my feelings, my desires and longings, all is for thee. Comfort thy servant and thy mother, in order that she may not fail in thy service at the sight of her own insignificance, and in order that she may not die for love of thee. Oh, how limited is the power of man, how circumscribed his capacity, how insufficient is human affection, as it cannot sufficiently render a just return for thy love. But the victory of mercy and magnificence must always be thine, and to thee belong the triumphal songs of love, while we must, on the contrary, always consider ourselves overcome and vanquished by thy power. Let us be humiliated, and let us grovel in the dust, while thy greatness is magnified and exalted in all the eternities." Unquote. The Heavenly Lady, partaking of the science of her most holy Son, sometimes beheld the souls which in the course of the new law of grace were to distinguish themselves in divine love, the works which they were to perform, the martyrdom which they were to suffer in imitation of the Lord. In this knowledge she became so inflamed with love that her longings of love caused in her a greater martyrdom than those actually suffered by the saints. To her happened what the spouse in the Canticles mentions, Canticles 8:6, that the emulations of love are strong as death and hard as hell. To these agonies of the loving mother, caused by the mortal wounds of divine affection, her most holy Son answered in the words there used, quote, "Place me as a sign or seal in thy heart, and upon thy arm," unquote, causing in her at the same time the full understanding of these words as well as their actual fulfillment. By this divine suffering, most holy Mary was a martyr above all other martyrs. Among such beds of lilies, the meekest lamb, Jesus, wandered, while the day of grace began to break and the shades of the ancient law receded. The divine child ate nothing during the time in which he was nourished at the virginal breast of his most holy mother, for this milk was his only sustenance. This was most sweet and substantial, since it originated in a body so pure, perfect, and refined, and one built up in exquisite harmony without any disorder or inequality. No other body was equal to it in healthfulness, and the sacred milk, even if it would have been preserved a long time, would have remained free from corruption by an especial privilege. It never changed or soured, though the milk of other women immediately degenerates and becomes corrupt, as experience teaches. The most fortunate Joseph not only witnessed the favors and caresses which passed between the child and its mother, but he himself shared in others which Jesus deigned to confer upon him. Many times his heavenly spouse placed him in his arms. This happened whenever she had to do some work during which she could not hold him herself, as for instance when she prepared the meals or arranged the clothes of the infant or cleaned the house. On these occasions St. Joseph held him in his arms, and he always felt divine effects in his soul. The child Jesus showed exterior signs of affection by his pleased looks, by reclining upon his breast, and by other tokens of affection usual with children in regard to their fathers. But in him these tokens were always tempered with kingly majesty. Yet all this was not so frequent in his dealings with St. Joseph, nor with such endearment as with his true Virgin Mother. Whenever she left Jesus in his care, she received from St. Joseph the relic of the circumcision, which the latter ordinarily bore about with him for his consolation. Thus both the two spouses were continually enriched, she by holding her most holy Son, he by his sacred blood and deified flesh. They preserved it in a crystal vase, which St. Joseph had purchased with the money sent to them by St. Elizabeth. In this they had enclosed the particle of flesh and the sacred blood shed at the circumcision, which had been caught up in pieces of linen. The opening of the vase was encased in silver, which the mighty queen, in order to preserve the sacred relics more securely, had sealed by her mere command. Thus the silver opening was more firmly sealed than if it had been soldered by the artisan who had made the vessel. In this vase the prudent mother treasured the relics during her whole life, and afterwards she entrusted it to the apostles, leaving it as an inheritance to the Holy Church. In this immense sea of mysteries, I find myself so annihilated and dumbfounded by my ignorance as a woman, and so narrowed in my powers of expression, that I must leave much of it to be fathomed by the faith and piety of the Christians. Instruction which the Most Holy Queen Mary gave me. My daughter, in the foregoing chapter thou hast been instructed not to seek information from the Lord by supernatural means, neither in order to relieve any suffering, nor in order to satisfy a natural hankering of curiosity. And now I exhort thee likewise not to yield, for any of these reasons, to the desire of performing any exterior action according to the promptings of nature. For in all the activity of thy exterior faculties and senses, thou must seek to moderate and subject thy inclinations, not yielding to them in their demands, although they may have the color of virtue or piety. I was in no danger of going to excess in these affections on account of my sinlessness, nor was there a want of piety in my desire of remaining in the cave where my most holy Son had been born and had been circumcised. Yet I did not wish to express my desire, even when asked about it by my spouse, for I preferred obedience to this pious inclination, and I knew that it is more secure for the souls, and more according to the pleasure of the Lord, to seek his will in the counsel and decision coming from other, rather than in their own inclination. In me, this course of action was advisable only on account of the greater perfection contained therein. But in thee and in other souls, who are subject to error in their judgment, this rule must be observed most rigorously, so as to prevent and avoid mistakes diligently and discreetly. For in their ignorance and pusillanimity, men are easily carried away by their feelings and inclinations toward insignificant things, and very often they occupy themselves with trifles as if they were important matters, and with vanities as if they were realities. All such activity weakens the soul and deprives it of great spiritual blessings, of grace, enlightenment, and merit. This doctrine shalt thou write in thy heart together with all the others which I am to give thee. Seek to use it as a reminder of all that I did, so that as thou hast come to know it, thou mayest also understand and execute it in thy life. Take notice of the reverence, love, and solicitude, the holy and discreet fear with which I conversed with my most holy Son. I always lived in this kind of watchfulness, and even after I had conceived him in my womb, I never lost it out of sight, nor did the great love which he showed me diminish it to me. In this ardent desire to please him, my heart found no rest until it was entirely united and absorbed in the enjoyment of this my highest good and ultimate end. Excepting at certain times, during which I rested in his love as in my sole joy, I invariably carried about with me this continual solicitude, like one who restlessly pursues his way, and who permits himself not to be delayed by anything that is useless or hinders the attainment of his desired object. So far was my heart from attaching itself to any earthly thing, or from following the inclination of the senses, that I lived as if I had not been composed of earthly substance. If other creatures are not free from passions, or do not overcome them as much as possible, let them not blame nature, but their own will. On the contrary, they justly incur the reproaches of weak nature, because, instead of governing and directing nature by the sovereign power of the will, they make no use of that power. They allow the natural inclinations to involve them in disorders, abetting it by the free will, and using their understanding to find still more dangerous occupations and occasions of ruin. On account of these pitfalls presenting themselves in mortal life, I warn thee, my dearest, not to hanker after or seek any of the visible things, although they may appear to thee necessary and most appropriate for the circumstances. Use all things, thy cell, thy garments, thy sustenance, and whatever else of this life, only in obedience and with the full consent of thy superiors, because the Lord requires this of thee. And it is also my pleasure to see thee apply all things for the service of the Omnipotent. According to these great rules which I have given thee, thou must regulate all thy activity. The three kings of the Orient come to adore the Word made man in Bethlehem. The three Magi kings who came to find the divine infant after his birth were natives of Persia, Arabia, and Saba, Psalms 71:10, countries to the east of Palestine. Their coming was prophesied, especially by David, and before him by Balaam, who, after having been hired by Balak, king of the Moabites, to curse the Israelites, blessed them instead. Numbers 24:17. In this blessing, Balaam said that he would see the King Christ, although not at once, and that he would behold him, although not present, for he did not see him with his own eyes, but through the Magi, his descendants, many centuries after. He said also that a star would arise unto Jacob, which was Christ, who arose to reign forever in the house of Jacob. Luke 1:32. These three kings were well versed in the natural sciences and well read in the scriptures of the people of God, and on account of their learning they were called Magi. But their knowledge of Scripture, and by conferring with some of the Jews, they were imbued with a belief in the coming of the Messiah expected by the people. They were, moreover, upright men, truthful and very just in the government of their countries. Since their dominions were not so extended as those of our times, they governed them easily and personally administered justice as wise and prudent sovereigns. This is the true office of kings, and therefore the Holy Ghost says that he holds their hearts in his hands in order to direct them, like irrigated waters, to the fulfillment of his holy will. Proverbs 21:1. They were also of noble and magnanimous disposition, free from avarice and covetousness, which so oppresses, degrades, and belittles the spirits of princes. Because these Magi governed adjoining countries and lived not far from each other, They were mutual friends, and shared with each other the virtues and knowledge which they had acquired, consulting each other in the more important events of their reigns. In all things they communicated with each other as most faithful friends. Excuse me. I have already mentioned in the 11th chapter that in the same night in which the incarnate Word was born, they were informed of his birth by the ministry of the holy angels. It happened in the following manner. One of the guardian angels of our Queen, of a higher order than that of the guardian angels of the three kings, was sent from the cave of the Nativity. By his superior faculties he enlightened the three guardian angels of the kings, informing them at the same time of the will and command of the Lord, that each of them should manifest to his charge the mystery of the Incarnation and of the birth of Christ our Redeemer. Immediately and in the same hour, each of the three angels spoke in dreams to the wise man under his care. This is the usual course of angelic revelations when the Lord communicates with souls through the angels. This enlightenment of the kings concerning the mysteries of the Incarnation was very copious and clear. They were informed that the King of the Jews was born as true God and man, and that he was the Messiah and Savior who was expected, that it was the one who was promised in the Scriptures and prophecies, Genesis 3:10, and that they themselves, the three kings, were singled out by the Lord to seek the star which Balaam had foretold. Each one of the three kings also was made aware that the same revelation was being made to the other two in the same way, and that it was not a favor or a miracle which should remain unused, but that they were expected to cooperate with the divine light and execute what it pointed out. They were inspired and inflamed with a great love and with a desire to know that the God made man, to adore him as their Creator and Redeemer, and serve him with most perfect devotion. In all this they were greatly assisted by their distinguished moral virtues which they had acquired, for on account of them they were excellently disposed for the operation of the divine enlightenment. After receiving these heavenly revelations in their sleep, the three kings awoke at the same hour of the night, and prostrating themselves on the ground and humiliating themselves to the dust, they adored in spirit the immutable being of God. They exalted his infinite mercy and goodness for having sent the divine word to assume flesh of a virgin, Isaiah 7:14, in order to redeem the world and give eternal salvation to men. Then all three of them, governed by an impulse of the same Spirit, resolved to depart without delay for Judea in search of the divine child in order to adore him. The three kings prepared gifts of gold, incense, and myrrh in equal quantities, being guided by the same mysterious impulse, and without having conferred with each other concerning their undertaking, the three of them arrived at the same resolve and the same plan of executing it. In order to set out immediately, they procured on the same day the necessary camels and provisions, together with a number of servants for the journey. Without heeding the commotion caused among their people, or considering that they were to travel in foreign regions, or caring for any outward show of authority, without ascertaining particulars of the place whither they were to go, or gathering information for identifying the child, they at once resolved, with fervent zeal and ardent love, to depart in order to seek the newborn king. At the same time, the holy angel who had brought the news from Bethlehem to the kings formed of the material air a most resplendent star, although not so large as those of the firmament, for it was not to ascend higher than was necessary for the purpose of its formation. Neat! It took its course through the atmospheric regions in order to guide and direct the holy kings to the cave where the child awaited them. Its splendor was of a different kind from that of the sun and the other stars. With its most beautiful light, it illumined the night like a brilliant torch, and it mingled its own most active brilliancy with that of the sun by day. On coming out of their palaces, each one of the kings saw this new star, Matthew 2:2, although each from a different standpoint, because it was only one star and it was placed in such distance and height that it could be seen by each one at the same time. As the three of them followed the guidance of this miraculous star, they soon met. Thereupon it immediately approached them much more closely, descending through many shifts of the aerial space and rejoining them by shedding its refulgence over them, rejoicing them by shedding its refulgence over them at closer range. They began to confer among themselves about the revelation they had received and about their plans, finding that they were identical. They were more and more inflamed with devotion and with the pious desire of adoring the newborn God, and broke out in praise and admiration at the inscrutable works and mysteries of the Almighty. The Magi pursued their journey under the guidance of the star without losing sight of it until they arrived at Jerusalem. As well on this account as also because this city was the capital and metropolis of the Jews, they suspected that this was the birthplace of their legitimate and true king. They entered into the city and openly inquired after him, saying, Matthew 2:8, "Where is the King of the Jews who is born? For we have seen his star in the east, announcing to us his birth, and we have come to see him and adore him." Their inquiry came to the ears of Herod, who at that time unjustly reigned in Judea, and lived in Jerusalem. The wicked king, panic-stricken at the thought that a more legitimate claimant to the throne should have been born, felt much disturbed and outraged by this report. With him the whole city was aroused, some of the people out of flattery to the king, others on account of the fear of disturbance. Immediately, as St. Matthew relates, Herod called together a meeting of the principal priests and scribes in order to ask them where Christ was to be born according to the prophecies and Holy Scriptures. They answered that, according to the words of one of the prophets, Micheas, he was to be born in Bethlehem, since it was written by him that thence the ruler of Israel was to arise. Thus informed of the birthplace of the new king of Israel, and insidiously plotting from that very moment to destroy him, Herod dismissed the priests. Then he secretly called the Magi in order to learn of them at what time they had seen the star as harbinger of his birth. Matthew 2:7. They ingenuously informed him, and he sent them away to Bethlehem, saying to them in covert malice, quote, "Go and inquire after the infant, and when you have found him, announce it to me, in order that I too may go to recognize and adore him." Unquote. The Magi departed, leaving the hypocritical king ill at ease and in great consternation at such indisputable signs of the coming of the legitimate king of Israel into the world. Although he could have eased his mind in regard to his sovereignty by the thought that a recently born infant could not be enthroned so very soon, yet human prosperity is so unstable and deceitful that it can be overthrown even by an infant, or by the mere threat of far-off danger. Thus can even an imagined uncertainty destroy all the enjoyment and happiness so deceitfully offered to its possessors. On leaving Jerusalem, the Magi again found the star, which at their entrance they had lost from view. By its light they were conducted to Bethlehem and to the cave of the Nativity. Diminishing in size, it hovered over the head of the infant Jesus and bathed him in its light, whereupon the matter of which it had been composed dissolved and disappeared. Our great queen had already been prepared by the Lord for the coming of the kings, and when she understood that they were approaching the cave, she requested St. Joseph not to leave it, but to stay at her side. This he did, although the sacred text does not mention it. Like many other things passed over in the Gospels, this was not necessary for establishing the truth of the mystery. Nevertheless, it is certain that St. Joseph was present when the kings adored the infant Jesus. The precaution of sending him away was not necessary, for the Magi had already been instructed that the mother of the newborn was a virgin, and that he was the true God and not a son of St. Joseph. Nor would God have permitted them to be led to the cave ignorant of such an important circumstance in his origin, allowing them to adore the child as the son of Joseph and as of a mother, not a virgin. They were fully instructed as to these things, and they were deeply impressed by the sacramental character of all these exalted and complicated mysteries. The Heavenly Mother awaited the pious and devout kings, standing with the child in her arms. Amid the humble and poor surroundings of the cave, in incomparable modesty and beauty, she exhibited at the same time a majesty more than human, the light of heaven shining in her countenance. Still more visible was this light in the child, shedding through the cavern effulgent splendor, which made it like a heaven. The three kings of the east entered, and at the first sight of the son and mother, they were for a considerable space of time overwhelmed with wonder. They prostrated themselves upon the earth, and in this position they worshipped and adored the infant, acknowledging him as the true God and man, and as the Savior of the human race. By the divine power which the sight of him and his presence exerted in their souls, they were filled with new enlightenment. They perceived the multitude of angelic spirits who, as servants and ministers of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, attended upon him in reverential fear. Hebrews 1:4. Arising, they congratulated their and our Queen as mother of the Son of the Eternal Father, and they approached to reverence her on their knees. They sought her hand in order to kiss it, and they were accustomed to do their queens in their countries. But the most prudent lady withdrew her hand, and offered instead that of the Redeemer of the world, saying, quote, "My spirit rejoices in the Lord, and my soul blesses and extols him, because among all the nations he has called and selected you to look upon and behold that which many kings and prophets have in vain desired to see, namely, him who is the eternal Word incarnate." Luke 10:24. Let us extol and praise his name on account of the sacraments and mysteries wrought among his people. Let us kiss the earth which he sanctifies by his real presence. Unquote. Amen. At these words of Most Holy Mary, the three kings humiliated themselves anew, adoring the infant Jesus. They acknowledged the great blessings of living in the time when the Sun of Justice was arising in order to illumine the darkness. Malachi 4:2. Thereupon they spoke to Saint Joseph, congratulating him and extolling his good fortune in being chosen as the spouse of the Mother of God, and they expressed wonder and compassion at the great poverty beneath which were hidden the greatest mysteries of heaven and earth. In this intercourse they consumed 3 hours, and then the kings asked permission of Most Holy Mary to go to the city in order to seek a lodging, as they could find no room for themselves in the cave. Some people had accompanied them, but the Magi alone participated in the light and the grace of this visit. The others took notice merely of what passed exteriorly, and witnessed only the destitute and neglected condition of the mother and her husband. Though wondering at the strange event, they perceived nothing of its mystery. The Magi took leave and departed, while Most Holy Mary and Joseph, being again alone with their child, glorified his majesty with new songs of praise, because his name was beginning to be known and adored among the Gentiles. Psalms 85:9. What else the three wise men did will be related in the following chapter. Instruction which the Queen of Heaven gave me. My daughter, the events recorded in this chapter contain much for the instruction of kings and princes and for the other faithful, as for instance the prompt obedience and humility of the Magi, which men should imitate, and the obdurate wickedness of Herod, which they are to fear and abhor, for each reaped the fruit of his actions. The kings reaped the fruit of justice and other virtues which they practiced, while Herod reaped those of ambition and the pride by which he had usurped the government, and of other vices into which he cast himself without restriction or moderation. But let this remark, together with the other teachings of the Holy Church, suffice for those that live in the world. To thyself must thou apply the doctrine contained in what thou hast written, always remembering that all the perfection of a Christian life must be founded upon the Catholic truths, and in the constant and firm acknowledgment of them, as they are taught by holy faith. In order to impress them upon thy heart, thou must profit of all that thou readest or hearest of the divine writings, and of what is contained in the other devout and instructive books concerning the virtues. Thy faith thou must accompany by the practice and abundance of all good works, hoping ever in the visitation and coming of the Most High. By such a disposition, thy soul will be prepared in the manner I require of thee. For I desire that the Almighty find in thee the sweet readiness to adopt whatever is manifested to thee, and to put in practice whatever may be enjoined without any human respect. I promise that if thou follow my counsel as thou shouldest, I will be thy star and guide on the ways of the Lord, so that thou wilt quickly arrive at the vision and enjoyment of thy God and of thy highest good in Sion, Psalms 83:8. In this doctrine, and in what happened to the devout kings of the Orient, there is contained a most effective means for the salvation of souls, yet this is known to a few and heeded by a still smaller number of men. It is this, that the inspirations and enlightenments are usually sent by God to creatures in a certain order. At first some are sent to incite the soul to practice some of the virtues. If the soul corresponds, the Most High sends other and greater ones in order to move the soul to greater perfection in virtue, and thus, profiting from previous graces, the soul is disposed for still others, receiving even greater helps and securing an increase of the favors of the Lord, according as it corresponds to them. Thou wilt therefore understand two things. First, how great a damage it is to neglect the exercise of any virtue, and not to practice perfection according to the dictates of the divine inspirations. Secondly, how often God would give great assistance to the souls if they would begin to correspond to the smaller ones, since he is as it were in expectation and hope that they will prepare for his greater ones. Apocalypse 6:20. For he wishes to deal with the soul according to his just judgments. But because they overlook this orderly manner of proceeding in his invitations, he suspends the flow of his divine gifts, and he refuses to the souls what was intended for them if they had not placed an obstacle, allowing them to fall from one abyss to the other. Psalms 41:8. The Magi and Herod pursued opposite courses. The Magi met the first inspirations and graces by the practice of the good works. Thus they disposed themselves by many virtues for being called and drawn by divine revelation to the knowledge of the mysteries of the Incarnation, the birth of the divine Word, and the redemption of the human race, and through this to the happiness and perfection of the way of life. But Herod, on the other hand, by his hard-heartedness and neglect of the helps which God offered him for the practice of virtue, was drawn into the abyss of his measureless pride and ambition. These vices hurled him into such vast precipices of cruelty as to be the first one among men to seek the life of the Redeemer of the world under the cloak of simulated devotion and piety. In giving vent to his furious rage, he took away the life of the innocent children and attempted by so foul a measure to advance his damned and perverse undertaking. All praise and glory be to our Lord Jesus Christ forever and ever. May God bless and keep you.